Hello, everyone. I'm Lai Shunan from Shanghai University. I'm the director of ICOM IMREC and chairperson of ICOM Asia and Pacific Regional Alliance, ICOM ASPAC. It is my great privilege to serve the three excellent, outstanding speakers and all of you in the upcoming 30 minutes. May I invite you, join me in welcoming the three speakers for today. Let's welcome them.
To be honest, well, I'm not an expert on the restitution of cultural relics. However, I have two important insights to share with you. I'm also interested in two important topics. Well, as a researcher of museology, as well as the engager in the museum industry, to my understanding, museum is such an institution. It is the institution to safeguard the production, interpretation, heritage of the cultures of a certain nation, a country. It is also a vector of old memories belonging to the whole world. Well, for all these cluster memories, among them, they are existing and also conserved and inherited in museums by other means as an ordinary audience, as well as a member of the general public. For all these cultural heritages, they also bear many of our spirits, our value propositions. We sincerely hope that, like our generations, I sincerely hope that in the spirit garden, we are able to refine them. We also sincerely hope that for the new generations, they can learn all those cultural heritages. So today, we are also joined by a number of college students at the site. We also hope for those young students, they can inherit those culture, heritages, and memories that belong to the nation and the country, and also to pass them on to their future generations. For the introductions that I gave to you, just prove that I'm not an expert of the cultural relics restitution. So for the following panel discussion, firstly, I just want to give the floor to those who have the questions for our speakers. So today we have three panelists, and Professor Emily is also joining us online. So any questions from our audience or from the online audience? Any questions?
Okay, if you don't mind. Carol, please.
Thank you to the three speakers for an absolutely wonderful session. I have so many questions, I hardly know where to start. But if I could, with Professor Wan, you mentioned that there was perhaps an opportunity for either ICOM or UNESCO to make some sort of a declaration around the return of cultural property. And one of the things that I understood you to say was that we have to really clarify the scope of such a declaration. And you started off by mentioning that there were some areas of non-negotiability. So, for example, the return of human remains or objects obtained by war. So it seemed to me as though there might be kind of various stages for this. I wonder if you can elaborate on that a little bit more about what might be in that kind of a declaration.
这个问题是关于这个人体遗骸和战争时期的文物的返还的特殊规定吗？
I'm sorry, Professor Wan, I missed part of the translation. Could you just make your comment again?
Sorry. Sorry, the question.
As I remember that you mentioned. Thank you.
It's lost in translation, I think.
Yeah. 是这样哈。
Okay. So actually for UNESCO or for other institutions, and when we issue the declarations, we may have certain priorities. Because for the colonial cultural relics, we have multiple different kinds, and also based on the past experiences, as well as the experiences from Germany and UK. And normally for human beings relics, they would also belong to the priority issue, because for the human beings relics, it has a strong ethical issue, and also in many jurisdictional cases, normally there is no exceptions in it. So once we confirm that it is the illegally obtained human beings relics, so we need to return them. Actually, last year, we had a new judgment made. So it is Buddha sculpture, actually back in 1996. So it was taken by someone we didn't know from a temple in Fujian province. To the appearance, it looks like a Buddha sculpture, but in it we have a human beings relics. So actually, the body of the Zhanggong was kept within the Buddha sculpture. Of course, the case was a very complex case. We will not go into details, but we think that actually for the human beings relics, it is very unique, and we need to give them some exceptional consideration. And even though it is not 100% in line with all the regulations that we have, but it is also has some ethics issue involved. And the second issue is about war, because for the cultural relics that have been taken illegally during the war, it is a national behavior. So it is the looting under the national behavior. And in 1954, it is strongly forbidden by the international law. So just like I mentioned, it is also a regulation of the international law. So it still has the legal enforcement capability. So that's the two issues, or the two things that we need to have to prioritize the restitution, namely the human remains. So for some objects, even though it looks legal, however, it is relevant with colonization, or it serves the colonial purpose, and it doesn't fully belong to the original legal possessor. So we need to consider the restitution, but sometimes we can delay this a little bit. Thank you, Professor Wang. So I understand we also have many other online participants. They also have numerous questions waiting for the answer. So we'll give the second question to the online audience. The second question is for Americo, because I think Americo is in the right position to answer this question. So the question is like this. I understand for many dislocated cultural relics and in the colonial country, they have been preserved and researched, studied in those countries for many years. And also, it has generated totally different knowledge framework versus the source country. During the restitution process, how can we treat those newly generated knowledge in the colonial country that keep the cultural relics? Thank you. Professor Amliko?
I must confess that I couldn't quite understand your question. The sound is not good.
So, Professor, the question is that, during the preservation and conservation of the cultural relics in the colonial countries, sometimes they will study the cultural relics and keep them for quite long period of time. And during that time, they're going to generate a new system of knowledge. So if we have the restitution and the return of the cultural relics to the source country, how are we going to deal with those newly generated knowledges and the knowledge system in those, colonial countries? Can you get the question?
Yes, it did. Thank you. And I think, of course, it takes a lot of local work and consent, political consent. There is, I mentioned in my presentation, the case of medical ancestral knowledge, which is some Aboriginal tribes in Bolivia or the Paraguaya. They have a knowledge on herbal properties that have curated for centuries, and they are not totally recognized in their own country. So to rebuild and reconstruct that knowledge needs a lot of consent and a lot of discussion among the local people. So even if it is a difficult process, it is not impossible. It's essential that institutions such as museums take the lead in making this change and promoting this sense of reconstitution of ancestral knowledge, and also of the values in which those knowledges were taken away and need to be taken and in concern in the current generations, not only among the ancestors, but also among the current generation.
Thank you, Americo. Thank you, Professor Americo.
I think there must some between the different language speak the same topic. It means from a Chinese point, Chinese region. It means all the objects was taken away from the original country, are collected in our museum, and we have do a lot of research. We have our monography on that. So this is the subject. So we have a lot of subjects on the objects. When we talk about return the objects, how we dealing with the subjects. Is that correct? Yeah.
So, Sean Pim, please.
Thank you so much for your nice presentation. We really enjoyed listening to your point of view. I have two questions. First one for Professor Wang about UNESCO conventions. What do you think UNESCO convention dates back to 1970 did for the origin of countries? I mean, in my opinion, it preserved only the market countries. It doesn't take the side of origin country. So what do you think about that? And also, what do you think about? I have some concerns about UNIDROIT Convention of 1995, especially for time limitation and good faith and bad faith. How can we recognize that? This is my first question for you, and the second question for Professor Yang. You mentioned that it's you missed or you have or you count 1.5 million object, Chinese object outside of the country. Is it true? So, and how can you count that? Because some objects still in private collections, so you can't know about them. And also maybe if I don't know if you have it here in China like we have in Egypt, illicit digging. So how can you count these numbers? It's like as I have some concerns about that. How can you explain it to me? Thank you so much for both of you.
So apologize. I'm not too sure about your question. So you're talking about 1970 convention and the 95 convention and the limitations. Is that what's your question?
For 1970, I say that it takes the side of market countries, not the side of origin countries. Do you understand what I mean?
I understand the state of origin and the market country, but I'm afraid I don't agree with you.
Oh, okay, we will just discuss. We discuss.
Yes.
But
and
about
the 1995.
Yeah, about 1995, we have some concern. Egypt, we didn't sign it. I am responsible about that because we have some concerns, especially about time limitation. It says that when we have in a case, we have just time limitation, and this is against Egyptian law. Egyptian law, all cases is still ongoing, even if it has 100 years. So for your UNIDROIT conventions, it gives us like 50 years only for time limitation for the cases. So this is, what do you think about that?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I'm gonna respond in Chinese, which is easier for me. So the 1917 convention focuses on the collaboration among countries. It also focuses on the illegal export of cultural relics and its return. For the return objects, there are some limitations. So it's not all cultural relics that are illegally exported will be restituted. It's only for public institutions such as museums or the archaeological sites or other similar types of public institutions that have such illegally obtained objects should be banned from exporting to other countries. Once we do that, So once we have the requirement on the export countries, the import countries should take steps to notify the export countries to take back such objects. This is something that export countries don't want to see because, for example, for us, we don't know that this is something that's already illegally taken away from us. And once that happens, we really have to know that it's really originally from us, because there's the requirement that for the cultural relics to be returned, you need to have it on your list of cultural relics before the return can take place. So that's the limit of the original law. For the 1995 convention, you've talked about the time limit. Of course, the definition of time limit is different from how we look at time limit now. So that's why we say that maybe we want to update the law according to the convention, because the time limit stipulated in the 95 convention is longer than the code of the time limit that we have now in the code that we put into practice. So let me take the second question about how many objects that are from China that are outside China now, and how many of them are illegally obtained. Actually, lots of scholars have done such studies. French scholars have done such studies, for example. One of them actually has a book about the objects from Yuan, and Japanese scholars have also studied the objects during certain dynasty of China and that are now in Japan or other countries. Many other scholars have also done such studies. So through those kind of studies, lots of information have been gathered. Also, in overseas countries, for example, in Canada, a certain museum, how many collections from China, those numbers are roughly over there. So in their introduction materials, you will be able to see such rough numbers. And such materials will give us some estimation into the numbers that we are discussing here, but the exact numbers, are hard. But scholars, after their study, have estimated with certain reasoning that this is probably roughly the number. So, for example, we've referenced the materials at home and abroad, and we've formed such numbers. That's also how I come up with the number. So 1.5 million for Chinese objects in overseas countries, and mostly are commodity products, or merchandise or art products, and 10% are illegally obtained objects from China. So that's based on the studies of the scholars at home and abroad. Thank you. Any more questions?
Thank you very much for the speakers. The speech were very informative, inspiring, and insightful. I'm from Bangladesh, Mahmoud Sirajul Islam, board member of ASPAC. We are in a dilemma whether we proceed for restitution our objects from the different countries. I would like to ask Professor Wang, is this country, I mean China,
is ready with relevant laws, policies, and necessary documentation for restitution of the lost objects? In other words, is there any policy gap for restitution of the lost objects? Would you please explain? Is there any policy gaps or guideline gaps to restitute the lost objects in this country?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. This is a very sharp question. Yes, policy-wise, we do emphasize the repatriation and restitution of the lost cultural relics. And of course, there are areas that we need to work on law-wise. For example, the cultural relics protection. We've paid more attention to the current cultural relics, but maybe not enough description and discussion of certain objects from the past. But we've signed such international conventions, meaning that we do pay attention to such efforts. But of course, signing the convention is different from enforcing it law-wise domestically. So these are the two steps. For example, the previous audience, a question about the 1950 time limit. If you look at the China law, there is a gap or difference between the two laws. So we do need to work on it.
So any other questions?
I'd like to find out. Stand up. I'd like to find out more about. I think for the also the benefit of the cultural heritage students here, how you distinguish between restitution and repatriation, and perhaps from your perspective too, because I think from your legal perspective, academic and cultural heritage management perspective, what you mean by restitution. It could be, kind of culturally bound too, and I think that sometimes that's when the disagreements or the conflict actually comes from. And I think the cultural heritage students will benefit from that moving forward. Thank you.
So we have the last question. Okay, the second row, please. I'm from Anhui Museum. So actually, it's my great privilege to attend today's meeting. So today we stay focused on restitution of the cultural relics. I'm going to share with you a case in the end of 1980s. And back then, we have 5 cultural relics were stolen, which were bronze relics. And back then, the stolen case was not solved in 2017. And in China, and in arbitration, actually we found these bronze. And also in the auction event, we identified this relic, and then the Cultural Heritage Administration pay a lot of attention to this case. And also I personally get involved in this case together with the public security. We brought back this bronze relic. However, this cultural relic is owned by overseas institution. So actually, that was happening during the pandemic. Among the 5 bronze cultural relics, 1 was still lost. So I think this is indeed a very good clue from the public security to the cultural heritage administration. So from the perspective of the culturalist restitution, and we already know the buyer of this bronze relic, and so the buyer understand that it is okay to give the donation. So through this clue, how can we further bring other relics back through legal channel? So I think this is more like comment. Well, this might not have a definite answer to this question. So I think we can also, have this discussion later. Well, I understand, well, through today's communications and also through today's discussions. And I just want to share with you my personal understandings. Actually, talking about the restitution, normally we will talk about the restitution of an object, whether it is archaeological relic or the historic object or object that has the scientific historic value. So it is far from adequate in terms of the objects restitutions when we talk about the restitutions, because there are many other things that not only have the historic, scientific, cultural values. So we need to pay attention to the spirit values of all these objects, because for the source country, for all the nations, it has the spiritual value. So that's the point I want to underscore. Yesterday, and during the opening session, Amanadi gave us the opening remarks, and also Emma raised up 5 questions. Why would we need restitution? When to do restitution? Who should we return to? And how can we do the restitution? All these questions, some are theoretical questions, some are practical questions. Some of them have multiple dimensions. Building involves economics, cultural studies, ethics, legal aspects, etc. And also, for some of those questions, the discussions and the studies are just yet begin, and there's still a long journey to go. I hope that for today's panel's discussion, it is just the beginning of this long journey. So on behalf of the audience, as well as the online audiences, I'd like to extend sincere gratitude to all the panelists who are involved in this session. Thank you very much.
请大家就座，下面我们将开始专题分享文物返还与创新。Please have a seat and let's move to session 4, Restitution and Innovation. 下面请大家入座。Please have a seat. 有请主持人徐坚教授，大家欢迎。Let's welcome the moderator Jay Xu.
Good morning. So everyone's here. May I call everyone outside to return or to reinstitute or not? It's my great honor to be the moderator for the following session and panel. This is the panel 4 and also the session 4. We will have 3 speakers. All of them will deliver their speech online. So we will have 3 speeches and for about 45 minutes, and then followed by a 30 minutes discussion. Our speakers in these sessions include Professor Heidi Geismar from UCL, and Professor Laura Evans from University of North Texas, and also Miss Anna Luther from Germany. So next, we will we will have the great honor to have all the speakers to deliver their speech online. Please show their lectures. Thank you.
Hi everybody, thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this expert panel. I'm so sorry I can't be there with you in person in China, but I hope that this recording covers my presence sufficiently and that you can hear me and see my images clearly. Today I want to reflect on my participation in a project that links Maori communities in London and New Zealand to the National Trust. Te Maru o Hinamihi, meaning the embrace of Hinamihi, was founded first as a friends group of the National Trust, comprising a group of scholars, cultural stakeholders and practitioners committed to opening up dialogue about the appropriate protocols of care for the Maori meeting house Hinamihi in the grounds of Clarendon Park, a National Trust property in Surrey. Over time, calls for Hinamihi's return to New Zealand have intensified, and after a catastrophic fire which completely destroyed the main house of Clarendon in 2014, a formal request was made for her return by the New Zealand government on behalf of her descendants. In the wake of the fire, and in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, this international negotiation has moved online, managed by a heritage consultant based in Italy, and linking Te Maru, now an independent organisation, and the National Trust to descendants of Hinamihi in New Zealand, who have now formed a formal group, Ngā Kohinga o Whakairo o Hinamihi, specially formed to make carvings for a new house to exchange with Hinamihi for her return. The three groups have met regularly over Zoom for several years to negotiate the protocols and structure of this return, changing practice at the National Trust and opening up a third space for the negotiation of new relations of care and accountability. Workshops and resources on cultural protocols have been shared, and new languages have been learned on both sides of the globe. Put in the context of my earlier work, which has explored the capacity of digital technologies to remediate both material collections and immaterial forms of knowledge and practice, here I want to explore some of the themes that emerged within our intensive online work and explore some of the changes I think that this has precipitated within the National Trust. These discussions have taken place in what has been a really febrile moment for discussions about restitution and repatriation within the UK, characterised by the current government laying down a mandate for retain and explain to arm's length national collections, and the head of the National Trust receiving death threats for publishing an inventory of properties connected to slavery and colonialism, Clarendon Park being part of that list. In this highly politicised environment, I want to focus on the ways in which the Hinamihi project has enabled a less polarised and yet still effective pathway towards restitution, and how digital communications have enabled new kinds of conversation and a new language of care to emerge. Here's a photo of Hinamihi in situ in Te Wairua in the North Island of New Zealand, and a photograph of her after the famous eruption of Mount Tarawera in 1886. Hinamihi was famous at the time for not only being carved by one of the master carvers of his time, Teni Waitiri, but also for sheltering her community and protecting them from the ash fallout of this massive volcanic eruption. Shortly after the eruption, she was purchased by Lord Onslow, then Governor-General of New Zealand, and brought back to his ancestral home in Clarendon Park in Surrey. After her purchase and her shipping back to England, Hinamihi was erected in various locations around the gardens of Clarendon from a boat, and sort of used as a boathouse and eventually as a garden house, eventually ending up on the lawn in the gardens designed by Capability Brown, tucked under a large tree facing the main house. Hinamihi is the only Maori meeting house in the UK, and the only in the world outside of New Zealand to be kept outside of a museum in the outdoors. And over the years, she has hosted christenings, marriages, memorial services, become a site of pilgrimage for Maori people visiting from home. She's hosted yearly feasts and fundraisers for the Maori community, and dance and kapahaka performances, as well as hosting the broader Pacific diaspora and groups who found in her a home away from home. In 2014, you can see here the fire that devastated Clarendon Park. And I think this is really important to recognise as the backdrop for a massive change in the conversation about Hinamihi's care. Prior to the fire, a long-term conversation had arisen about the management and care of Hinamihi, which was stewarded by diaspora members of the London Maori Club, Ngati Ranana, and by an archaeological conservator, Dean Sully, based at University College London, working closely with Tene Waituri's descendant in New Zealand, Jim Schuster, who was also a heritage consultant and craftsperson. Te Māori was formed in this backdrop, taking advantage of a structure within the National Trust, the Friends organisation, to advocate for Hinamihi's care from within the Trust. And over time, Te Māori became the organisation that coordinated with the Trust to manage plans for the care of Hinamihi. This included yearly cultural care days with the involvement of volunteers to come and maintain Hinamihi in situ, ensuring or working against the weathering process she was experiencing from being outside. At the time, I think it was largely felt that there were these two very polarised models of care for Hinamihi emerging. And they were ontologically distinct. One was what we could call Western, understanding Hinamihi as an artefact or object, part of a collection that needed to be maintained, preserved, conserved. The other evinced a Maori worldview, which enforces the idea of Hinamihi as an ancestress, as a person filled with mana, power, wairua, spirituality, and embedded in relationships or whakapapa of accountability and guardianship. And I think it's fair to say that for the first few years of Te Māori's existence, and the first few decades, I should say, these two polarising models often clashed with one another. By 2012, Te Māori felt frustrated with its role as a friends group, which is a largely celebratory and positive support role, and wanted to push harder from the outside on the National Trust to try to change the conditions of Hinamihi's care and maintenance. So they reformed as a community interest group, and finally today are in the process of becoming a community interest organisation with charitable status. A high turnover of staff at the National Trust and lack of continuity in the management plan for Hinamihi's care also led to a kind of failure of communication and a failure to connect these two dichotomous understandings of Hinamihi together. And it was just before the fire, actually, that the idea of repatriation or return was fully laid upon the table. The idea being that if Hinamihi could not be cared for beyond being seen as a low priority artefact in the Trust's collection, it was much better off for her to go home, where she could really be treated like, given the respect that she deserved by her community. Sited under a large tree, at risk of falling branches, exposed to wind and rain, her carvings were looking worn and faded, and her structure, along with the plain earth floor inside, was increasingly considered unfit for purpose by the cultural communities who wanted to be able to keep warm in winter or stay the night under her eaves, to be able to wash and to cook, to keep themselves and Hinamihi warm. And in 2014, just before the fire at Clandon, a delegation arrived from New Zealand to set in motion a formal request for Hinamihi's return. And these plans intensified after 2015 in the wake of the fire at Clandon. The fire at Clandon also prompted the rethink for the National Trust, increasingly recentering Hinamihi not just as an object or thing in the garden, but as the other house, bravely standing, facing the ruins of Clandon as an equal. And since 2015, the emerging plans to reactivate Hinamihi, not simply as a treasured artefact, but as a living cultural and spiritual centre, also changed Te Māori's identity for Hinamihi's people back at home. Te Māori being firstly recognised as a pukinga group, a group of experts using their cultural knowledge, for example, my known as an anthropologist, gathering to support this transformation within the Trust as much as the return of Hinamihi. The backdrop to this has been a long-standing museological shift to recognise Maori protocols in the presentation of Maori taonga treasured possessions around the world. Since the very famous exhibition held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1985, Te Māori, it has become established practice to open and close exhibitions with dawn ceremonies, to include kaumatua on elders and as advisors, to travel with objects, and to recognise that with respect the spiritual status of museum collections for Maori communities. Whilst this has been a very sort of comfortable space in the exhibitionary domain, it's been harder to integrate this fully into the structure and institutional protocols that actually manage collections and museums. Although this is slowly happening, and I think Maori people and collections have really led the way for this outside of the care for things like indigenous collections in native North America. So we have examples such as Rauru, another house carved by Tenny Whiteley in Hamburg. We have examples of the canoe in the Leiden Museum of World Cultures, which is activated every year through a cultural exchange in which Leiden students learn Maori rowing techniques and protocols and activate the waka by rowing her up and down the canal. This has been a much slower process in the UK. There have been notable examples and exhibitions in museums like the Cambridge Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, to some extent the British Museum, in trying to acknowledge different cultural protocols of display as well as cultural protocols of care. But overall, this was a very new kind of conversation for the National Trust to experience. I'm only touching in the very brief time I have on some of the complex interactions that emerged to support eventually the agreement that the National Trust has made to return Hinamihi to New Zealand in exchange for carvings for a new meeting house that will continue to support the Maori and Pacifica diaspora community, as well as drawing on a Maori ethos to support other kinds of community engagement under her eaves. In the rest of this talk, few minutes that I have left, I just want to focus on the role that digital media have played in this domain. In an earlier book called Museum Object Lessons for the Digital Age, I explored the ways in which museum practices of digitization, from cataloguing, 3D scanning, as well as new forms of digital communication and representation, can both amplify existing representational conventions and policies in museums, but also contain the capacity to import alternative cultural protocols and practices of care. In the case of the Hinamihi project, much of which has intensified since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, almost all of our work has become virtual. In some ways, this isn't new. The primary register of heritage management could already be seen as virtual, taking place in the form of meetings, policies, the filing of planning documents, the dissemination of information and text. But the argument of my book that digital media both contains a myriad of potential affordances, but is actually much more easily co-opted into existing conservative ideologies, and also, I think, distracting discourses about the power of technology, which are not often realized in these settings, doesn't actually result in a lot of change. The argument then I want to make is actually twofold. It's perhaps the opposite of what you might have expected me to say. I'm not just celebrating the capacity of digital media to change the ways in which we do things. I'm cautioning actually against a digital fetishism that assumes that these technologies can bring completely new ways of being and working into heritage regimes and relations. I want to combat a kind of technological determinism that forgets to foreground the social worlds and relations that digital technologies not only construct but also inhabit. In the case of the negotiations around Hinamihi, digital relations allowed for a closing of distance between New Zealand and the UK. They allowed for new and increased participation in the daily round of meetings and other bureaucracies that underpinned the decision-making around what to do with Hinamihi. And they were also, however, enabled by a series of perspectival shifts within the National Trust that themselves were critically engaged with the polemical publics and counter-publics produced within and through social media and other digital formats. And our project quietly sought, through careful and considered dialogue, to resist the polarisation and politics that was being implemented or amplified during the course of our project. So I suppose I'm arguing that we need to be anthropologists of all of these projects and make sure that, as well as understanding the affordances of technology, we understand the contexts as well. Our digital space can therefore be seen as a form of quiet resistance or rebellion against a virtual public sphere that emerged after the publication of the National Trust's interim report into connections between colonialism and properties now in the care of the National Trust in 2020. The online publication and dissemination of this report resulted in a wave of negative media coverage and social media reaction, which drowned out many of the positive voices. It resulted in the formation of a new group called Restore Trust, who have attempted to take over the trusteeship of the National Trust, and have also succeeded in challenging the charitable status of the Trust in Parliament, arguing that the Trust had betrayed its charter by becoming political through the publication of the report. They lost that case in Parliament, but it was still seen as an existential threat to the very being of the Trust. As you can see here, National Trust Director Hilary Grady received death threats and other violent criticisms over social media, which, as she comments you can see in the leader, she did not report to the police because she understood it to just come with the territory. The controversy of the report, which simply listed which properties actually had connections to, for example, money made through sugar plantations in the Caribbean or other kinds of colonial enterprise, was used to fuel populist criticism of woke political correctness and manufacture a sense of kind of incontrovertible and dichotomous culture wars. And this was exploited more and more by factions of the tabloid press, polarized more and more through social media, particularly Twitter. It's not an understatement to say here that social media has fueled a powerful sense of mistrust and anxiety and antagonism around vital questions around our shared inheritance of the legacies of colonialism and the global relations that continue to play out in its image. The UK is not alone in this, but it is behind other countries in Europe, for example, or in other settler colonial contexts in acknowledging the problematic legacies of colonialism and making national overtures to try to resolve them or think about how they might be addressed at national level. So this is the context that we came into our digital space. National Trust employees feeling battered, embattled, scared, and extremely worried about what could happen if our project became known about and sort of adopted within this incredibly febrile environment. But it also enabled us to create what I think of as a third space, where we could facilitate a quiet revolution. We start each meeting with a Maori blessing and a welcome, and we end with a closing chant. And after several months, several National Trust employees have been taking lessons in Maori language. Scheduling our meetings in the early mornings or late at night, out of our normal working hours, has enabled us to include Maori people, who in turn have responded to the conversation by creating and delivering workshops and learning sessions to teach National people at the National Trust about the design, culture and language of traditional Maori architecture, carving and customs. When a large delegation of people from New Zealand was able to come to New Zealand, relationships of accountability and respect and personal connection had already been forged. The Trust has committed time and labour, even within an increasingly fraught financial environment, to supporting community building in this way. And it's been recognised that cultural work, social labour and commitment was needed to manage the successful return of Hinamihi. Whilst this was often done within the backdrop of media blackouts and confidentiality imbued with this kind of fear, the investment and commitment to this space, I think, was really something special. Locating the fire locally, the fire as well has also opened up an alternative perspective on materiality, shifting our position on conservation and care that we also brought into or that was facilitated digitally. In her book, Caitlin De Silva explores numerous heritage projects that work within a material environment of dissolution and impermanence. And after much discussion and consultation, it has been decided not to restore Clarendon Park, but to redevelop the site as a monument to the material processes of making of the English country house. The exposed brickwork and the roof beams, all that the fire has left behind, are to be used as indexes of the myriad hands of craftspeople and labourers that built the house, showcasing, as the Trust puts it, the many hands that made the house. And in this context of a renewed attention to materiality comes a renewed engagement with the possibility of seeing Hinamihi beyond the traditional viewpoint as simply a carved object in the garden. The destruction of the main house has also opened up a conversation about the other house and her value and meaning. And the engagement with Hinamihi's communities and a renewed attention to the terms of this engagement with a recentering of Maori language has brought the Maori concept of face-to-face or kanohi ki te kanohi as a framework for understanding the past-future relationship between the two houses and the new house that will come when Hinamihi returns. To conclude, Whilst digital technologies have facilitated this project, which could not have happened without the affordances of communications techniques like FaceTime or Zoom, including the bridging of time and space and the facilitation of co-presence, these digital practices were also fundamentally enabled by a shift in the cultural norms around heritage management and protocols and care that are slowly in the UK responding to a more global conversation. It's been a huge shift for the Trust to organise meetings that acknowledge not just the time zone in New Zealand, but Maori practices of consensus decision making and consultation, and to acknowledge the emotional as well as practical registers that are required to keep Hinamihi alive, activate her ongoing presence and ancestral authority. The opening up of concepts of community to include not just Maori and Pacifica diaspora, who are present in the UK in such small numbers as to barely register in national museum cultures, but also to key Maori stakeholders in New Zealand, is also a quiet instantiation of the growing recognition that colonial histories and relationships need not just be acknowledged about being in the past, but are very much in the present. And I suppose my conclusion is really that the digital space has created a third space that has enabled, I think, real growth and change in the recognition of accountability and national accountability towards colonial histories and the legacy of ongoing coloniality into the present. I've run out of time, and I hope this has just given you a very small snapshot of the project, and would be very happy to take any further questions. Thank you to Te Maru for supporting this presentation. All mistakes, of course, are my own. And thank you to colleagues in our Tri-Rupu group in the National Trust and also in Ngā Koinga for supporting this really inspirational process of exchange.
My name is Laura Evans, and I'm an associate professor and the director of the Art Museum Education Certificate at the University of North Texas. And today I wanted to share a case study about why I think artist-made reproductions can strengthen museums and their communities. And to do this, I'll start with a brief examination of the changing views on the acceptability of reproductions in art and in museums. And then I'll advocate for how museums can approach repatriation cases on a case-by-case basis by replacing an original work of art with an artist-made reproduction from the source community where that original work of art was from. And the West's acceptance of reproductions has ebbed and flowed throughout history. Plato espoused that copies were deteriorated or defective originals, and he attempted to reorient humans away from the everyday world of the mimetic appearance towards a space of originals, ideas, and the good. In this world where making copies was incredibly laborious and arduous, originality was much easier to insist upon. Then with the birth of practical photography in 1839, the schism between copies and originals deepened. By the 1930s, leading philosophers and academics were articulating that divide. And in 1935, Walter Benjamin wrote his seminal text, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, which is widely cited and clung to in art history and in museums. In it, Benjamin argues that the aura of a work of art, that intangible, inherent quality only found in an original, is lost when it's reproduced by mechanical means. And he would say an aura cannot be reproduced. And accordingly, a reproduction, can't possibly have the weight and gravitas that an original has. This is the element of Benjamin's argument that museums really like to cling to. But in other forms of art, the emphasis placed upon the aura of the original is not as weighty or important. Latour and Lowe write about how different forms of art are dependent upon copies as a means of distribution. They point to the performing arts, to literature, and to music. Each of these relies on an original, but on an infinite variety of reproductions, and in some cases, variations. As an example of this schism, the authors focus on a play, King Lear, where the audience delights in reinterpretations of the original text. New actors, new stagings, new locations for the play invigorate it. We may glean new information from the play in a restaging that we might not have been able to understand from a faithful reproduction of Shakespeare's text. And Latour and Lowe ask, why is it so difficult to say the same thing and use the same type of judgment for a painting or a sculpture? Why is it so difficult indeed? I'd like to give an example of an original work of art being returned to a source community and being replaced by another work of art. There are few examples of this, and even fewer still, where a museum replaces an original with a source artist-created reproduction. But I'd like to share one example of this kind of collaboration, and that is with the Ghost Dance shirt, formerly of the Kelvingrove Museum in Glasgow, Scotland. Luan Neil, a repatriation specialist at the Royal British Columbia Museum in Victoria, has suggested Indigenous objects in museums be returned to the tribe from where they were removed. Furthermore, she thinks that Indigenous artists from these communities should create faithful replicas of the original to take the place of the restituted object in the museum. Quote, these replicas could remain with museums along with much more information, so they can continue to serve as educational tools for people of all cultures. Visitors would know that we are not a dead or dying culture. We are still here. Neil's suggestion was enacted many years earlier in the 1990s at the Kelvingrove Museum. The Kelvingrove was in possession of a Lakota ghost shirt, which had been wrongfully taken from a Lakota corpse following the battle at Wounded Knee. The Wounded Knee Association was made aware of the existence of the Ghost Dance shirt in the Kelvingrove's collection in the mid-1990s. Led by Marcella LeBeau, a Lakota tribe member and the secretary of the Wounded Knee Association, they asked for the return of the Ghost Dance shirt. The museum, believing the shirt had been acquired in good faith, entered into conversation with the Wounded Knee Association. Through mediated discussions and after Glasgow city residents supported the return of the Ghost Dance shirt, it was returned to the Lakota in 1998. What's remarkable about this story isn't the repatriation of the Ghost Dance shirt. These repatriations happen, if not frequently enough. What is noteworthy about this case are three things. Number one, the Glasgow public was consulted about whether they supported the return of the Ghost Dance shirt, and Glasgowians voted for its return. Number two, Marcella LeBeau, who led the Wounded Knee Association in their repatriation claim, made a faithful reproduction of the shirt and gave it to the Kelvingrove, where it remains on display. And number three, the museum displayed the reproduction of the shirt along with a narrative of the repatriation story. The faithfully reproduced Ghost Dance shirt that is on display at the Kelvingrove has been described by the House of Commons Culture, Media, and Sport to be, quote, in no doubt, a better, more educational, and more interesting museum display than that of the original shirt. Comments by visitors on a board in the exhibition were almost entirely favorable, such as one that said, quote, all of humanity is connected to each other, and seeing the shirt, the reproduction of the shirt, and the narrative of the Lakota in the repatriation of the shirt reminded them that we are all connected. Another quote said, so glad to see this as a discussion. I knew very little about procedures and cases of repatriation. So it would seem that exhibiting the absence of an object and the story of a new object taking its place can have a powerful impact, no less than achieved by displaying that original. Not only has the Kelvin Grove gained a richer, more nuanced, transparent, and moving exhibition of the related Ghost Dance Church, the relationship with the Lakota tribe has blossomed. Bailey Elizabeth Cameron of the Glasgow City Council said, quote, "We have ended up forging a place in the history of the Lakota, and the Lakota have become part of the history of Glasgow museums." So instead of displaying a static object from a faraway culture, the Kelvin Grove is now part of a global, dynamic relationship. What the museum might have lost in the original object, they've gained in a far more worthwhile relationship for a museum in the 21st century. Likewise, the Lakota have a relationship with Scotland in a way that they didn't have before. In regard to another repatriation case in Scotland, Curtis wrote, quote, "The keeper of the headdress that was returned from the University of Aberdeen's collection bought a kilt jacket to wear when dancing the headdress as a mark of its sojourn in Scotland." So I think both of these examples show that in an increasingly globalized world, museums should celebrate the intersections between cultures that can be developed through repatriation. Stephen Kahn, a historian, has asked, do museums still need objects? And yes, I believe museums do still need objects. It is quintessentially what makes a museum a museum. But do museums need all of their objects? Maybe not. Do museums need experiences as much as objects? I think we continue to move in this direction. Can thoughtfully made artist-created reproductions of repatriated objects create new experiences for visitors that can compete with the experience of seeing the original object? I think so, absolutely. I'll rhetorically ask, does viewing a copy somehow lessen the experience of going to a museum? I think when contextualized properly and when so much is at stake, artist-made reproductions of items returned to source communities can actually enhance the experience of going to a museum. And when the artists from the source community create new objects, that new object that they make is endowed with an aura itself. It's certainly different than the aura of the original, but it's still important. And it's key to the success of museums that when replacing originals with artist-made reproductions, that narrative of the return becomes a part of the object story. Latour and Lowe write that when a visual work of art is copied, quote, "a sense of fakery, counterfeiting, or betrayal has been introduced into the discussion in a way that would seem absurd for a piece of performance art. It seems almost impossible to say that a facsimile is not about falsification, but it is a stage in the verification of the artist's achievement, a part of its ongoing biography." In this vein, it's key to the success of museums that when replacing originals with artist-made reproductions, that narrative of return becomes a part of the object's story. This story should be detailed in interpretive materials that surround the reproduced object. Source communities should tell their own stories of loss and what it means for them to be reunited with the objects that were taken from them. And hearing those counter-narratives could be a powerful reminder for why museums should support the return of objects to source communities. Furthermore, source communities could tell the stories of creating the artist-made reproduction that remains at a museum. And this story of the replacement object could be an opportunity for museum visitors to learn more about the culture that object was created in and the traditional methods of creating that object. Through counter-narratives, there are countless opportunities for learning and growing to occur in the museum itself, in the source community, and in the visitor, who benefits from seeing the many layers of collaboration between museum and community. After the opening of the Acropolis Museum in Athens in 2009, The Guardian surveyed United Kingdom residents about whether they thought the Elgin marbles should remain at the British Museum or be returned to Greece. An overwhelming 94.8% of respondents voted for the return of the Elgin marbles. 5.2% voted for the marbles to remain in England. That is a staggering difference and signifies something bigger that more museums should be paying attention to. Museum visitors want to have an authentic experience, but maybe more than this, a moral experience that they can feel good about. And I think it's time to for museums to let visitors decide how they feel about reproductions rather than for us to decide how to feel for them. We do not know better than they do about how they will feel about museums that have replaced originals with artist-made reproductions so as to return those originals to the source. Fuseki has argued that the reunification discourse is academically led and does not portray wider public opinion. And I think if museums were to conduct focus groups, they would probably find that museum visitors feel more strongly about justice and return than about the aura of an object. No attorney writes about museum going, quote, "We want an authentic encounter as opposed to the experience of gazing at reproductions in books." But who is we, and who gets to speak for the museum visitor in the case of artist-made reproductions and repatriations? Museum visitors could be as inspired or even more inspired by an authentic encounter with an artist-made reproduction than in a rote encounter with an original, if the original has been returned for moral and ethical reasons. But we should let visitors speak for themselves. We need more surveys and studies that ask visitors the very important questions of what they support. Do they support a displaced original whose loss is being mourned by the community where it was created? Or do they support an artist-made reproduction that highlights the story of return, reunion, and collaboration? Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. I'm really excited to present today Digital Benin, Reconnecting Royal Art Treasures, and I'm very much looking forward to our conversation afterwards. I will show you in the beginning of this presentation a short video introduction produced by our team to give you an overview of our complexities and knowledges that we brought together, and then take 10 minutes to give you a short introduction into some data realities that we need to consider when working in digital heritage projects, and how we worked with these realities in the project Digital Benin to contextualize these data realities in the context of the object's origin. So let us start with a brief introduction to Digital Benin, Reconnecting Royal Art Treasures by our team.
Explore Digital Benin. Digital Benin brings together all objects and rich documentation material from collections worldwide to provide a long requested overview of the royal artifacts from the Kingdom of Benin looted in the late 19th century. The historic Benin objects are an expression of Benin arts, culture, and history, and were originally used as royal representational arts to depict historical events, to communicate, to worship, and perform rituals. Digital Benin connects data from over 5,000 objects across 131 institutions in 20 countries. A foundational space on digital Benin is EUTO, a display of the historical objects with their correct Edo designation. Listen, view, and read about their use, production, and function of the historic objects, or print out a coloring book and language cards for each Edo object group. As a central tool of digital Benin, the catalog forms one of two digital spaces on the platform where the dispersed Benin objects are for the first time digitally reassembled. It shows over 12,000 images and 30 3D models. Objects in the catalog can be searched, filtered, studied, and viewed. Expanding the object cards allows for more information to be presented at one time. Now, let's navigate to the institutions page. Here, one can study each institutional collection of Benin objects and sort the list of institutions by name, object count, and country. Selecting an institution gives access to an introduction page with details about the institution, the collected data, and overview of objects in the collection. On the provenance page, one can study the roles, biographies, and object relations of provenance names that documents the trajectories and ownership histories of the collections, and that can contribute to identifying many of the royal treasures that were taken by members of the expedition and the small number of objects that arrived in Europe before 1897. Digital Benin has identified close to 1,000 names of provenance entities. The map shows contemporary Edo South and Benin City. The map draws on the historical relationship among people, places, and objects to reveal the significant functionality of the historic Benin objects to the Benin people. On the left side, one can filter through the information and locate various palaces, memorials, and more. Click on the right side, and one can see an overview of the location of institutions that hold the scattered historic objects today. By selecting an institution, one can see where objects are located today. The oral history page is fundamental for understanding the historical and cultural importance of the historic Benin objects. Listening to Benin people contextualize objects through reflections on our history and traditions is an effective way to gain insight into our culture and history, which has been passed down from one generation to another for centuries. Itaido means the story of the Benin Kingdom. This space presents Benin history from an indigenous perspective using Benin authored sources exclusively. Itaido is a concise but comprehensive literature review of the documented history and traditions by Benin scholars and writers. The MAC in Hamburg, Germany hosts this extensive project with a generous grant from the Ernst von Siemens Constitution, a 14-member international project team of principal investigators, researchers, designers, and developers compiled the relevant object data and research on the platform between 2020 and 2022.
So after this brief introduction, I want to introduce you to the Benin model, which has two premises, namely to connect data from institutions internationally without changing the diversity, multiplicity, and locality of data and data structures that institutions are working with to store, collect, and preserve information about objects in their collections, and secondly, to bring this data out of its institutional context and in relation to a community-driven, in situ, and culture-grounded embeddedness. We received over 400 data sets from 131 institutions because some institutions have multiple databases where they store different types of digital assets, for example, images, collection documentation, or preservation might be stored in different database or filing systems. Sometimes each department has an independent database that cannot be accessed by staff outside of that department. Not only did all data sets that we received have different metadata structures, they also included multiple data standards. Here's a list of some standards used in museum contexts. However,
Some museums are also working with internally defined standards, and smaller institutions are often bound to data entry conventions depending on the staff that is currently responsible for the data entry. We currently do not have one standard that is used to organize cultural data in museums internationally. Standardized information exists in various ways in databases, and we wanted to avoid the possibility to lose information that might be particular to one institution. Digital Benin preserves the structures and data produced by the participating institutions in order to reflect the ways each institution records, stores, and presents its own data, and at the same time makes it possible to search and filter across all data sets that we received. The institutional data was linked to a Digital Benin authored metadata structure or translation layer that you see here. We received over 400 data sets with a total of 2,896 unique field titles that were detected and compared, and 3,502 field titles were mapped into the Digital Benin authored metadata structure. The institutions provided between 4 and 294 fields in any export format that you can imagine. The result of this is of this translation layer and of the development is a filter that would allow users to conduct a text search in all fields that are connected to the distilled connection layer that I just showed you. So for example, the all fields filter on the site that I'm showing you right now allows the user to select a specific field in combination with the text search. Selecting a specific field means that the text search is only executed in the selected field. So the fields in the filters are linked to all fields that were identified with overlapping values. So for example, material links to fields such as medium, materials, materialien, or and other fields. So for example, I can now search for a specific word in the fields that are connected to the metadata structure or translation layer material. At the same time, we developed a controlled vocabulary that is specific to the historic Benin objects and connected all objects to the vocabulary that we developed. That connection layer again allows to show how all institutions have described their objects, and we merely connected the objects to a filter rather than changing or editing the data. This would allow museum staff to conduct a text search in their own language or standard or conventions and use the filter that we created as well. So for the first time, you can now see all the Lief plugs in one space, or you could filter, for example, leopard in the designation space, which would then show you this result here. And you can then go into the record itself again. In the time frame that we had, we concentrated on building filters or designations, categories, and provenance names, but this, of course, is expandable. We quickly realized that most institutions do not describe objects in Edo language or according to a place, function, and use in the community they were taken from. The information we receive from the institutions are specific to the institution or the specific to a museum object. The hierarchical cataloging of objects is specific to the logic of the collection. That what I mean with that is that objects are grouped, described, and labeled in relation to the collection of the institution and not to the cultural embeddedness over time. And so I want to take a few minutes to show you how we approach the recontextualization of objects in their place of origin. The spaces in Digital Benin that show this approach are Eyoto, Iton Edo, the map of Benin, of the Benin Kingdom and Benin City, and the oral history space. All spaces that you find on the website are woven together, and you as the user can enter into the knowledge base and take your path through the knowledge that is accumulated on the platform. The linking of the website is lateral and horizontal, which means that you can move from one space to the other and explore deeper into several interactions that we build in one space. I will show you very briefly the Eyoto space. My colleague Elagosa Obubaifo conducted a study in Benin City to identify designations for the historic objects in Edo language, which is foremost a spoken language that is context-specific, which means that many iterations of the vocabulary existed, and this is one of the multiple possible designation corpi that could exist. She interviewed producers that are making objects today in, for example, the Bronze Casting Guild. She consulted with art historians and linguistic professors in Benin City to find designation for the objects. A literature review of existing mentions of certain object groups was conducted as well with Imogen Carlson, our researcher here in this project. The result of this study is a space that reordered the objects according to the Edo object group, which is here shown in visual language brought to the platform by the Edo artist Ozaze Amarazun. And we also brought in spoken language. And so this space shows visual, spoken, and written language of the object designation of the Edo designations. And every space here shows again the data that was transferred by the institutions. I want to briefly show you a second space that is woven to both of the spaces, the catalog and Eyoto, which is our history space. My colleague Godfrey Akator conducted a field research in Benin City and interviewed participants and contributors that contextualized the historic object into their history and culture through oral accounts that were passed down from one generation to another. And you can see songs, prayers, and listen to also guild contexts for these objects that we're showing on the platform. As you can see here, from the oral history space, you can come back into the Eyoto space and explore the objects through the Eyoto space in the context also of their institutional data that we have received. My 15 minutes are coming to an end, but I encourage you to explore the Knowledge Forum Digital Benin and dive deeper into the learning space and also view the documentation on the space where we brought the descriptions of every space together, and also view all of the contributors that have contributed to this project. Thank you very much.